Thanks a lot, Stephen. Hey. The secret to the energy part at whatever it is, 2 is coffee. So I'm not sure exactly how much time I have because I think my talk is scheduled to end at 3.
You can talk over that whole, but it'll be recorded as well.
Okay.
So if anybody has to step off, everything's going to be recorded for the whole session, so you take the time with you.
Right, yeah, if you have to go at 3, it won't hurt my feelings. And you can check out the recording afterwards. But I do plan to take an hour. Yes. I guess that's what I got ready to do. So this is a little bit different for me because I don't usually talk about Russia. My PhD is in modern German history. But when Stephen told me that the topic for this week that is responses to the Holocaust, I immediately thought of the Soviet responses to the Holocaust and the Russian response to the Holocaust because of current events. So obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine that started in February of this year really heralds a new era in US-Russian relations. So for the last 10 or 20 years, we've kind of hoped / pretended that Russia was not an adversary of the United States. But at this point, there's really no doubt about that, and that's just not going to go away. And so I think as teachers, it would be useful for you to have a refresher about Russia because your students are going to be asking you about what's going on over there, I presume over and over and again in the coming years, because this conflict is going to be protracted, and Russia-U.S. relations, maybe the early 80s, which is when I was born. So that's why I hit on this topic, and I thought that the Soviet / Russian treatment of the Holocaust can offer a pretty interesting insight into something that actually has universal relevance, which is that in the absence of a civil society, in the absence of free discourse, where people can share their ideas and debate the meaning of the past, which is what the case was not in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there was an unchallengeable authority, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and what they said goes. And so they substitute society for a top-down, dogmatic, autocratic line. And that is incredibly dangerous. Whenever to dictate, and Brooks, no disagreement on penalty of prison terms, it's an incredibly dangerous place to be. So I want to go through more or less the last 70 years of Russian history, from Stalin, who was in charge of the Soviet Union when the Holocaust happened, all the way up to Putin today, and kind of use their attitude, the official attitude of Moscow, whether it's in its theoretically communist Soviet guise, or if it's just nakedly Russian nationalist imperialism, trace that thread to sort of reveal how dangerous that can be when we're just going to have the state tell everybody what the past means, and that's it. Okay, so that's my goal. So like I said, I'm going to do this chronologically, and we really do have a lot to cover. So I think I'll just get into it, and hopefully I can do this expeditiously. So Stalin. I'm going to say that Stalin, in fact, is an ambivalent figure, which is not something you often hear, because the manifold crimes of Stalin and the regime that he constructed and the toxic waste that's left over from that regime that continues to this day, such as the regime in North Korea, which is one of Stalin's gifts to posterity, right? But I will say that he is ambivalent for this reason. Here is a map of Europe in 1924. And as you can see, the Soviet Union out there in the east is a much diminished entity compared to what the Russian Empire had been going into World War I before the Bolshevik Revolution. And it is overwhelmingly peasant, 80+% peasant, overwhelmingly illiterate, and a non-entity in terms of an industrial power. That's what Stalin inherits when he begins his reign in 1930. Over the course of Stalin's rule prior to the Second World War, he took that and created a gigantic military industrial complex, without which Nazi Germany would not have lost the war. He did that on a mountain of human bones, on 3 million Ukrainians starved to death, on hundreds of thousands of political prisoners shot, and on millions and millions and millions of political prisoners enslaved. But he built the industry that beat the German army. And therefore I say that he's an ambivalent figure. Whoops. Okay. So what's pictured here is the signing of the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23rd, 1939. The so-called Hitler-Stalin Pact. You can see Stalin there. This is his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. And behind him to the left is Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister. It should not, if you put two and two together, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is signed on August 23rd. Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1 week later. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was Stalin giving Hitler the green light to begin the Second World War. That's what it was. And the official, formal, announced portion of the pact is this is just a non-aggression pact. We're going to stay out of each other's hair because we're so against war. But the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact were a partition of Eastern Europe between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. This is the German text of it. And here is the proposed agreement on the left, and then what actually happened on the right. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This is when World War II begins in Europe, and I'll just draw your attention to the fact, this has been pointed out by others, that about 80% of the people who die in Europe during the Second World War die between Berlin and Moscow geographically. That's where the vast majority of the fighting was done. And that's where the killing centers were, Auschwitz, Treblinka, etc. And that's also where the Holocaust by bullets occurred. So much of the territory in which the Holocaust took place was either controlled by the Soviets prior to the Holocaust, or at least came into possession of the Soviets after the Holocaust. So the Holocaust, that's where it happened. And for the people in these regions, here is a photograph of a German officer shaking hands with a Soviet officer. For the people in these regions, obviously, the process of being occupied by one of the most notorious totalitarian states of the 20th century, and then being occupied by another of the most notorious states of the 20th century, and then going back to being occupied by that first notorious example of totalitarianism in the 20th century, was extremely disruptive and traumatic, and threatened the disintegration of their whole societies. The Soviets, for their part, committed plenty of mass atrocities in the new territories that they seized. So this is some propaganda about a real event, the Katyn Forest Massacre that occurred in 1940, where about 20,000 Polish officers were shot by Stalin's instrument of terror, the NKVD, in Belarus. And the Nazis made a ton of hay out of that atrocity when they found the Soviet mass graves and unearthed them. Here is a photograph that shows exhumed prisoners from the central prison in Riga, Latvia, who had been shot by the NKVD prior to the German arrival after the German invasion. So the Soviets extended their power over part of Finland, the Baltic states, part of Poland, and part of Romania, and proceeded to commit grand atrocities in these areas, which the Nazis could then exploit to make hay out of, to mobilize and whip up the local population against the Soviets. All right. Here is a map showing the status quo in Europe prior to the German invasion of the USSR, which begins on June 22nd, 1941. So as you can see, it's a very different map from the map of 1924. Stalin has reasserted Moscow's control over the Baltic states, a substantial piece of Poland, which is now folded into the Belarusian SSR, and Moldova. So he has clawed back much of the Moscow's imperium that was lost during the Russian Civil War that followed the Bolshevik Revolution. But then, of course, Hitler breaks the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because it had lost its utility. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact guaranteed Soviet neutrality while Hitler polished off the democracies in the West. And now that Hitler was satisfied in the stability and solidity of German control over the rest of Europe, now he could begin his real aim all along, which is a giant ideological and racial crusade against communism and the Jews, who he saw, phantasmagorically controlling the Soviet Union. And here's the extent of the German advance into the Soviet Union. So the conquest of very nearly all of Ukraine, the Baltic states, and then part of Western Russia, but never quite made it to Moscow. So that means that most of World War II on the Eastern Front, in fact, took place not even on Russian territory, but on Ukrainian territory, on the territory of the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, Belarusians, and indeed into Russia itself eventually. This war was fought incredibly cruelly by the Nazis, who went into it in advance, saying we're not going to follow any of the accepted rules of warfare at all. This is no holds barred. And if it hadn't been for the Holocaust against the Jews, probably the biggest Nazi crime for which they'd be notorious today is the deliberate starvation of 3 million Soviet POWs. Just in barbed wire enclosures. Okay. The Holocaust that the Nazis implement. So I can only be brief about this, but there's a couple necessary things you have to know. In 1939, there was no plan even to murder all of the Jews of Europe. On January 30th, 1939, Hitler gave a speech to the Reichstag saying that if world Jewry succeeds in plunging Europe into another world war, this time it won't result in the defeat of Germany, but in the extermination of the Jewish race in Europe. Hitler said that 8 months before the war, 7 months before the war, January 30th, 1939. What that was his way to signal to his guys, start thinking big, start thinking on a continent-wide basis, because German power is set to expand, and start thinking more radically. Not about mean things we can do to encourage the Jews to leave, but about killing them. Start coming up with ideas. And one problem that the Germans faced over and over again with every success of German arms was that every time they conquered a new territory, their Jewish problem got bigger. So 600,000 Jews in Germany in 1933 when Hitler took over. The conquest of Poland will bring 3 million Jews into the territories that the Reich controls. And so to head off that problem, the SS, with Hitler's assent, came up with a new plan, a new way of doing things in this grand crusade against the Soviet Union. which is this time when we take territory, we're going to kill all the Jews as we go. And that's what the mission of the Einsatzgruppen were. So the Einsatzgruppen are Himmler's task forces, and they're the ones who commit what historians now call the Holocaust by bullets. Not the gas chambers in Poland. The prototype gas chamber at Kelno only started operations in December of 1941. Killings in the Soviet Union, mass shootings, 5-digit mass shootings, have been going on, and I'm not sure why my screen stopped sharing. Mass killings in the Soviet Union began immediately with the invasion. Let's see here. Can somebody come and get my screen to share again? I don't want to mess about that. Okay, here is the difficult part of this, or at least complicating factor here. The total manpower complement of the Einsatzgruppen, who anticipate encountering 2 or 3 million Jews who will be their mission to kill in the Soviet Union, the total manpower complement was 20,000 guys. Started with 3,000 in June of 1940, and they expanded it in July to 20,000. Not good enough, not going to be anywhere near enough. And so what they needed was local volunteers to help do the dirty work. And so there was a concentrated effort using propaganda, in some cases using coercion, to enlist the voluntary activity of local collaborators who will kill Jews at the behest and under the orchestration of the. Could you get it to share the screen? I can't find Zoom on here now. Oh, yeah. So to that end, they recruited Estonian, Latvian, Polish to some degree, but Ukrainian collaborators. And those people in 1940, as a consequence of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in many cases, had become Soviet citizens. So Latvians who enjoyed national independence in between the world wars for the first time ever, for example, become Soviet citizens in 1940 because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So these are Latvians, members of the RI's commando. And so that's uncomfortable for the Soviets, that there are now Soviet citizens, Estonians, Latvians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and ethnic Russians for that matter, who out of hatred for Soviet power, out of anti-Semitism, out of the need to suck up to what looks like is going to turn out to be the winning team, the Nazis. There's a whole panoply of different motivations, but the fact remains 200,000 plus Soviet citizens helped the Nazis commit the Holocaust, and these are a couple of them. So the answer to that in Soviet propaganda was this, and this is the first sort of phase of Soviet response to the Holocaust, which is that all of the peoples, the fraternal peoples of the Soviet motherland, are all victims of the German fascist invaders. And all of them are rising up as one to the defense of Stalin, to the defense of the motherland, and to the destruction of fascism. So Kazakhs and Russians and Tajiks and Latvians are all united in this proletarian brotherhood to kick out the Nazis. And so the propaganda, which is to say, the official public stance of the government in Moscow and of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was that there were no collaborators. There were no collaborators. Everyone here is united. And they go to great lengths to underscore this by selecting particular episodes wherein non-Russians are described as performing heroic deeds against the German fascist invaders. So this is in Almaty, Kazakhstan. That's me in 2015, to the monument to the 28 men of Panfilov's anti-tank brigade who helped stop the German advance outside of Moscow, right? So So non-Russian ethnicities are valorized as exemplars, as exemplary of a post-national Soviet identity that is implacably hostile to fascism. Okay. What about the Jews, though? So this is a double-edged sword. So if the Communist Party's official position is this is a post-national, totally deracinated workers' state, then there's also no scope to single out Jews as a particular victim category. So Jews who are killed by the Nazis are described sometimes as Soviet citizens of Hebrew nationality, but usually just as Soviet citizens. We'll leave it at that. Occasionally there'll be an offhand reference to a ghetto, but it's not going to be, pointed out that all of the inmates of ghettos were Jewish by definition, right? And so just as the nationalities from whom collaborators sprang is elided in the official Soviet narrative, so too is the Jewish identity of the victims. Because everybody in the Soviet Union lost people to the German fascists. What's the point in singling out one particular ethnicity and its suffering? Because that'll just create friction inside of this multinational empire that we've got going. Okay. This is a photograph of Auschwitz. It should be pointed out of several things. Like I said before, the Soviets did most of the fighting and most of the dying against Nazi Germany. They lost, when the estimates are between 20 and 27 million people killed in the Soviet Union as a consequence of the German invasion, when was the last war the United States fought where our guesstimate is within plus minus 3.5 million lost, right? We have no experience in this country of trauma on that scale. Whereas in Europe, the United States lost 265,000 killed in Auschwitz. So we're talking about a couple of orders of magnitude difference. And of course, the Soviets were the ones who liberated all the actual death camps, just because of geography. The death camps were all in occupied Poland, and so the Soviets got there and saw those. This is a photograph from Nuremberg. The famous Nuremberg trial in 1946 of the 20 some odd principal, Nazis who had not fled to Latin America, killed themselves, or been killed during the war. This is everybody who we got left, and the United States and the Soviet Union, together with Britain and France, together sat in judgment. And following the Nuremberg trials in 1946 was a whole complex of additional cases that the Allies tried, called the International Military Tribunal, that continued in session until 1949. And those cases were the last real form of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, even as the Cold War began to descend. The one thing we could all agree on, in other words, was the Nazis were bad. The Soviets had their own trials as well. So Friedrich Jeckeln is pictured here. He was the higher SS and police leader for the occupied Baltic and part of Belarus. He's the one who masterminded the Rumbula action in November and December of 1941 outside Riga. 25,000 people shot in 2 days. Jeckeln, that's the guy. They hanged him in 1946. And so the wartime line about we are all friends here in the Soviet Union. You Latvians who were incorporated in 1940, you Ukrainians who never left Moscow's orbit that we held on to during the Russian Civil War, together with your great Russian brethren, are all in it together against fascism. The defeat of Nazi Germany gave the Soviet Union a whole new lease on life, a whole new claim to legitimacy. That the revolution and Lenin and stuff got stale, right? The victory over fascism is what Russians have been proud of ever since 1945, and the sacrifice that it took to get there. And so the line continues.
You Latvians, you Estonians, et cetera, we're all friends in this great brotherhood of nations. Meanwhile, actual guilty people were relentlessly hunted down from the Soviet Union proper all the way to the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, which becomes East Germany in 1949. They are hunted down with no due process whatsoever, nothing we would recognize as due process. Torture is used, habeas corpus, forget it. We don't need to, and for example, the RI's commando, I showed you a picture of those guys, Latvian volunteer, Holocaust perpetrator, Nazi collaborators. There were 1,200 guys in that unit. The Soviets prosecuted 356 of them, which proportionately is a huge number. Most of the people who committed the Holocaust were never punished at all. If you can get a third of the unit actually tried over the space of decades, that's very impressive. And so they were not messing around. They knew, in other words, the NKVD and Stalin, they all knew who was guilty. They knew what the real crimes were. They knew who did it. They knew where they did it. They knew how they did it. They had all the graves in the territory that they controlled after the war, all of the forensic evidence, all of the witnesses. And they pursued that very diligently. Their denazification efforts in their occupation zone of Germany went far further than US denazification did in what becomes West Germany. However, being honest about what they were finding out would put the lie to the claim that when the German fascists invaded the Soviet Union, we were all in it together. And everybody agreed that we had to protect Stalin and we had to protect the Soviet experiment and the communist future and so on. If they were honest about all of the collaboration, they would have to then look themselves in the mirror and say, geez, why were so many people in our society so totally against the Soviet government with its forced collectivization and purges, et cetera, right? It would open up Pandora's box to criticism of the Soviet government itself. And it would also give oxygen to the kind of inter-ethnic feuding that could have torn the Soviet Union apart just like Yugoslavia came apart in the 1990s. So we got to suppress all that. We got to suppress all that. Even if it means that the public thinks that all Latvians and all Ukrainians, et cetera, are all innocent. We'll behind the scenes, we'll prosecute these guys. But publicly, we're all friends. Got it? And that was the first phase of Soviet justice. Meanwhile, of course, the Red Army. I just want to put a little bit of a marker down here. Because the Red Army notoriously committed all kinds of crimes. So yeah, they defeated the German army, which is a big deal. But they also went on to denude the landscape of food and consumer items everywhere they went outside of the Soviet Union. And notoriously, and the Soviet Stalin's government was completely aware of this, systematic rape of Polish, but especially German women in the Soviet occupation zone to the tune of hundreds of thousands of women. Hundreds of thousands in 1945 and 1946. Until eventually the authorities decided we're going to have them, they're going to need to cut that out now. But originally, it was just understood that that's what they're going to do. And who are we to stop those heroes from doing whatever they want? And at the end of Stalin's reign, he had more than reestablished the old borders of the Russian Empire. In fact, Moscow's reach now went into the middle of Germany. Russia had never been that powerful before, ever in its entire history. Half of Europe under Moscow's sway. The Soviet Union, a nuclear power. Soviet industrial productivity rivaling that of the United States, maybe, arguably, not quite, but getting there. And all kinds of non-Russian nationalities subjugated to the great Russian nationality that formed the core of the Soviet Union, whatever its ideological pretensions were. It's a Russian empire, and it always was. And the further we get away from it, the more all of that communist ideology just really just seems like window dressing. It's just a Russian empire. That's my view. And Stalin dies. And if you thought Mitch Bloomer had big shoes to fill, Stalin left some mighty, mighty, mighty big shoes to fill. This is a guy who built a cult of personality, created arguably the world's most fearsome totalitarian police state ever. Certainly on a scale, right? You could say probably North Korea is worse than Stalin's Russia was, but this was, this is a giant, police state, and now this guy's gone. Dies in 1953. And this is the map of Europe showing the NATO alliance, during the Cold War. Okay. The leader in the Soviet Union after Stalin is this guy, Nikita Khrushchev, or in Russian, Khrushchev. We Americans say Khrushchev. So Khrushchev, in charge, we just say for convenience, 1953 after Stalin dies, until 1964. And Khrushchev will preside over a massive, massive shift in the Soviet public attitude towards non-Russian nationalities in the Soviet Union and the Holocaust. So the original, plan of Khrushchev was this: we got to put the Soviet Union on a totally new footing for the Cold War, right? Stalin, came up to oppose the Nazi fascist menace, but the new American enemy is of a totally different nature. And the Cold War competition is not just a military competition, but it's an economic competition, it's a cultural competition. We're vying to see who can create the better way of organizing humans for all of the future, right? And so the gulags start to shudder. He starts closing down the gulags. Khrushchev's the one who, in theory, disbands, but in fact just kind of renames and renovates the NKVD, and it becomes the KGB. He liberalizes a bit of the police state. People can now say a little bit more in public without being fearful and whatnot. And he issues an amnesty, incidentally. All of the German POWs who have been building the Moscow subway and stuff are free to go home in 1955. And so Khrushchev is trying to pivot away from Stalinism, get the Soviet Union past Stalinism, past this grim totalitarian thing, and to start trying to experiment, et cetera, et cetera. Whenever people who are at the sharp end of empire detect weakness in the center, revolts break out. And so in 1956, there is a revolution in Hungary, which is not part of the Soviet Union, but it does have a communist government that's installed by Moscow that lacks popular support, but does enjoy the support of the Red Army. And it is almost toppled in 1956. And so here's somebody's welded a stop sign to a giant sculptural head of Stalin that they had sawed off of some monument somewhere. And so Khrushchev has to send tanks. And this picture could practically have been taken in any of a dozen Ukrainian cities today. Russian tanks in somebody else's destroyed city. It's a common, it's a recurring theme, I guess, in European history. So the Hungarian Revolution is crushed. And the Hungarian revolutionaries, who were actually students for the most part, are called fascists. Why are they called fascists? Because they are a non-Russian nationality that is seeking independence and self-assertiveness. That is enough to make them fascist in Moscow's book. And so an entirely revamped, totally reimagined history is now going to be imposed from Moscow under Khrushchev concerning the Second World War, collaboration, and the Holocaust. And this new line, get to that, this new line is that in fact, rather than a glorious, frictionless brotherhood of workers and peasants rising up as one, regardless of their ethnicity and nationality, to oppose the German fascist invaders. Now the story is about Latvian fascists and about Ukrainian fascists, and on down the list. That in fact, all of these countries in Eastern Europe that we, the Soviets, aka the Russians, had come to dominate, they were all at least fascist curious, if not outright fascists. And we saved them from themselves. We saved them from their perverse fascination with fascism. We destroyed their armies. We've taken over their country, and we are imposing what is good for them on them. And so every country that was influenced by Nazi Germany during the Second World War and participated, or whose countrymen participated to one degree or another in the Second World War, at some point had to face some kind of a reckoning, right? And usually that was a generational thing, right? When people who were born during World War II noticed this weird uniform in their dad's closet when they're 15 or 16 and want to know what it means, right? Every nationality had, there was a period, namely the 1950s, where nobody is talking about this really. And then in the 1960s especially, that's when all of a sudden, big generational conflicts blew up about what the parents' generation did to screw up the world so bad, basically. And so the way that Latvians and Ukrainians, et cetera, were first introduced to the notion that their countrymen had been complicit somehow, is when it was being screamed at them from a bullhorn in Moscow that your country is a fascist country. And you better be grateful that we, Russia / the Soviet Union, control you now. And so that was used as a justification for all kinds of Russification policies. So like the Latvian Communist Party was purged in the late 1950s and early 1960s under Khrushchev. Thousands of Latvian communists, for being too nationalist or too unwelcoming to the hundreds of thousands of Russian military colonists and their families that were settled outside of Russia after World War II in all of these places to lock down Moscow's power there. And then of course, there's what about the Jewish victims? Okay, so if the Soviet line about who committed the crimes has completely changed to, in the first place, being all Germans, and now in the new revised version, totally condemnatory of all of these nationalities as such. The early 1960s and throughout the 1960s was a big boom in monument building throughout the Soviet Union. So this is a monument in Latvia at the concentration camp called Salaspils. And you'll notice that any identifying symbols that could say anything about who these people were are totally ablated in this completely monolithic Soviet monumental architecture. These are just workers and peasants. These are just Soviet citizens, maybe Soviet citizens of Hebrew nationality, but Soviet citizens who are the victims. And that itself is a species of Holocaust denial. That the Soviets, for their ideological reasons, because we're supposed to be post-nationalist as communists, we think nationalism is false consciousness, so there's an ideological justification. But I think the real reason is just imperial power calculus. We're not going to identify, we don't want people thinking in these segmentary ethnic identities. We want to homogenize everything. And so therefore we're not going to point out who the people were actually who were killed. This is very interesting. So this is in Latvia too. And this is a monument from 1964. And I'm not sure if I can, easily blow this up, I guess I can. This monument, was erected in 1964 under the Soviet totalitarian regime by activists of Riga's Jewish community. It was the only Jewish memorial to victims of Nazi terror in the territory of the USSR. 1964 was when this was built. The only monument to the victims of the Holocaust that mentioned that they were Jewish. Surprising. I mean, seriously. Okay.
Where's that at again?
This?
Yeah.
This is in Rummel Forest. This is where 25,000 Jews were killed. 1,000 German Jews from Berlin and 24,000 Latvian Jews were killed on November 30th and December 8th, 1941. Okay. Where am I out of time? Okay, I got to speed this up a little bit. So, following Khrushchev, 1964 to 1982, Leonid Brezhnev running the show in the Soviet Union. Brezhnev, the subsequent Soviet leader. And the one thing I want to say, the main thing I want to say about Brezhnev is he presided over the refusnik phenomenon. So refusniks, so-called, this is kind of slang term, for people who had been refused permission to emigrate from the Soviet Union in the late 1960s and 1970s. So people who are applying to leave the Soviet Union. And many of them, if not a majority, then at least a plurality, were Soviet Jews trying to get to Israel. And the Soviet government was not letting them out. They were being refused permission. Hence, they were called the refuseniks. But who can blame them, right? For being members of a community that isn't even allowed to publicly mention that their ethnicity had been the target of a genocide. And instead, right, so the refuseniks, I'm going to point them out. And then there was the Prague Spring in 1968. This is under Brezhnev's tenure. Once again, a satellite government, this time the communist government of Czechoslovakia, is being challenged at home because the majority of the public does not like that government and sees it as a government that's been imposed by a foreign power, the Soviet Union, and seeks to get that government to reform itself. They didn't even try to overthrow it. The protesters, and this is the 1960s, the protesters in Czechoslovakia didn't even try to overthrow the communist government. They were just asking it to reform, become a little bit less militarized, a little bit less regimented. And so what happens is the Soviets send troops there. No, you're not allowed to leave. You can never leave the orbit of Moscow. This picture could have been taken anywhere in Ukraine in the last 3 months. All right. Now I want to contrast this image with this. This is Willy Brandt. This guy is the German chancellor it comes in at the very end of the 1960s. He's chancellor in the beginning of the 1970s. He's a member of the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democratic Party was, if you just look at the historical record, the most uncompromising enemy of the Nazis from the word go. The Social Democratic Party of Germany was the most dedicated anti-Nazi force in the entire country when it mattered. And his name, in fact, isn't even really Willy Brandt. That's a pseudonym that he took when he had to flee Germany in 1933, when Hitler became chancellor. And now it's his turn. So in the late 60s, early 1970s, Willy Brandt is the chancellor of Germany. Olaf Scholz, who is the chancellor of Germany today, same party, Social Democratic Party. And what Germany had been doing stands in total contrast to the Soviet way of handling the trauma of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Now, I want to be very clear. What happened in West Germany was still muddled, still imperfect, still in some regards shameful, but the trajectory of it was like this. late 1950s, West Germany starts putting Nazis on trial autonomously, not at the goading of anybody. We're trying these criminals, right? The archives, all of the archives, the federal archives in Germany, the Bundesarchiv, totally open to all researchers. You want to show up, look at some stuff from the Nazi period, you will not ever be obstructed by a German archivist. I can promise you that. All of their stuff on the Nazis is an open book. They make no attempts to obfuscate that history. They build it into the curriculum for teachers like you. It's a requirement in the German educational system. And their society has been dealing with this, not just as part of a state-directed effort, but having conversations about Oma and Opa, right? Every family has had to do something, have some talk on this topic. And no Russian statesman has ever done anything like that. That's December 1970. That is the Chancellor of West Germany visiting Warsaw 2 years after the Prague Spring was crushed, visiting Warsaw in the Eastern Bloc, visiting the site of the former Warsaw Ghetto. And everybody thought he was just going to lay a wreath, but he collapsed to his knees. And you can imagine the photos being taken right here. In a display of penitence on behalf of the German state that was the legal successor of Nazi Germany. My God, what did our government do? So that's how that's how German society was changing, right? Under the influence of a free civil society and academics that were free to pursue the truth. Okay, Gorbachev. So I'm going to be a little bit terse as we're coming up on time here. Gorbachev kind of represents the third final phase of Soviet responses to the Holocaust on its deathbed. Gorbachev comes in 85, and the Soviet Union is no more as of December of 91. And so he is the leader who presides over the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And his signature policy, his signature policy was glasnost, which means transparency. He wanted to restructure the Soviet economy, recognized that that was imperative if the Soviet Union was going to continue to exist, because its economy at this point was just busted. They had no growth, they were dead in the water. Perestroika, right? Restructuring. But to get to perestroika, in order to enable us to restructure our economy and stay afloat somehow, we got to make sure everybody's not terrified to death of saying anything out loud because of the NKVD. Because sorry, not the NKVD anymore, the KGB, because we're a police state. So how can we make people feel comfortable speaking their mind and pointing out where the problems are in our economy? That's where glasnost comes in, transparency. We, the Communist Party, for the first time in our entire history, are going to start to be honest with the Soviet people about where we're at. So vital statistics, like if you want to know what the infant mortality rate in Osceola County is, right? You just Google it. All vital statistics in the Soviet Union before Gorbachev were state secrets. Nobody knew what the alcoholism rate was. Nobody was allowed to know about juvenile delinquency or statistics about rape or anything like that. It was all secret, because if the Soviet public was exposed to the truth of how bad we're really running this place, they'd overthrow us in a second. Gorbachev was incredibly naive, in my opinion. I don't understand how he got to the apex of power in a place like the Soviet Union, thinking that if we just start telling the truth to people, they'll start to trust us, right? As if. So one of the real milestones of Gorbachev's tenure was the admission for the first time ever that the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which partitioned Eastern Europe with Hitler, were not a Western fiction. it had been maintained by every Soviet government since 1939 that the secret protocols of the pact, whereby we're going to get Finland and the Baltic states and Bessarabia in exchange for not fighting the Nazis. That was everybody in the Soviet Union was told by the Communist Party that was a lie. That's a Western lie, and you're a dupe of Western propaganda and disinformation if you believe it. Gorbachev himself thought that was Western propaganda until he authorized the historians to go into the sealed archive, and they came up with a Russian copy of it. Gorbachev didn't know that. Think about how much of a landscape of untruth the Soviet Union had become, that you can ascend to the pinnacle of political power and still be completely enthralled to that system's propaganda. They had been lying to themselves and to each other for so long that they forgot what was even true anymore. That's what that is. And on the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 50-year anniversary, there was an event called the Baltic Way. This is August 23rd, 1989. And it was a human chain that formed involving 2 million people from Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, through Riga, the capital of Latvia, through Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. 430 miles. A human chain 430 miles long. That's greater than the distance between Miami and Jacksonville, if you've ever had to drive that. That's gigantic, right? To underscore the point that these countries came under Moscow's control only with the blessing of Adolf Hitler. In other words, Soviet power is illegitimate. And so these are caskets draped in the national flags, and then behind them are the Soviet flag and the Nazi flag crossed over. That's how most Eastern Europeans feel about the Soviet Union. They're just another totalitarian state that destroyed democracy or destroyed national independence at any rate, and ruined everybody, ruined generations of lives. This is 1990. You'll notice that in fact there is a Soviet flag here under the Golden Arches. This is the McDonald's that opened in Moscow in 1990. And what the 1990s really represent, so Soviet power completely cracks up in 1991. Half of the Communist Party is still supportive of Gorbachev. The other half are hardliners who wanted to crack down. All of Eastern Europe, all those regimes have evaporated because Gorbachev wasn't going to send the Soviet Russian army to support them anymore. And so they're all swept out in 1989. And the Soviet Union is on life support, and there's an attempted coup against Gorbachev by the hardliners. Swooping into Gorbachev's rescue is this guy with his hand in the air, Boris Yeltsin, who shows up. He's the mayor of Moscow, actually elected, unlike anybody in the Communist Party. As part of Gorbachev's reforms, Yeltsin was elected as mayor of Moscow, and he shows up on a tank in front of their parliament building to declare Russian independence from the Soviet Union. So that's checkmate. Soviet Union is gone after that. And in its place, Russia and all of these independent national states like Ukraine and Latvia and the rest of them. But the 1990s is a gigantic, gigantic, gigantic missed opportunity. Because here's what never happened under Yeltsin, who's in charge from 1991, December, until 2000. No member of Stalin's NKVD was ever put on trial for nothing. Nobody who committed crimes of mass killing on behalf of the Soviet government was ever investigated or tried by the Russian government, at least. Nobody. Right? The people who populated the gulags with millions of slaves in Siberia and Central Asia and the Arctic Circle in the 1930s at the behest of Stalin, none of those guys was ever punished for that. The people who planned Stalin's aggressive war against Finland. Like the Soviet line was that the Great Patriotic War, which is what we call World War II. The Great Patriotic War began on June 22nd, 1941, when the German fascist invaders, crossed the border into the motherland. Not when we invaded Poland on September 17th, not when we invaded Finland in November of 1939, not when we annexed and then had sham elections in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in June of 1940, right? Not when we seized part of Romania, but only when we were attacked. That's when World War II starts. Not the fact that we attacked every single country on our western border with the blessing of Hitler first. So there was never a reckoning by any stretch of the imagination. And this is a piece of art from a Russian artist that was created in 1992. And I display it because it represents a path that Russia didn't take, which was a path where you look your country's history in the mirror yourself, right? Where you critically examine the pathologies and the iniquities of your own country's past and interrogate that in the hope of creating a better country. They knew every single, so this is one thing that is just impossible to get Americans to understand, myself included. When we lived in Russia, we had friends, and once you get to know them more and more, and you've known them for months, and eventually you want to know, like, so what was it? What was the deal with Stalin, right? Every single family has somebody who just disappeared, never heard from them again. Every single Russian family, let alone non-Russian family, in the former Soviet Union had somebody who was a victim of Stalin. Somebody's uncle, your grandfather, your brother, whatever, everybody. Could you imagine? I was like, Mitch, who did FDR kill in your family? Right? And every American has some family member who FDR had killed. Right? It's a totally different country. And they can't face it. They never have. They just never have. And so, what do you know? Russian soldiers in front of some Soviet-era junk, right next to a mass grave that they created. This is Chechnya in the 1990s. There was a war there intermittently across the 1990s. That squirt on the left is Putin. This is Boris Yeltsin enjoying a 2 to 6% approval rating in 2000 when he finally went away. Putin was a member of the KGB, obviously. This is how Putin's government has presented. This is from 2014, the Crimea crisis, when Russian forces annexed Crimea, and then they held a referendum. They sure know how to run sham referendums. They've had decades and decades of practice doing it. Here's how they couch the choice. You can live in a Ukrainian Crimea that is Nazi, or you can live in a free Russian Crimea, right? I'll just remind everybody that although it was several years after this, because this is 2014, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of the wartime president of Ukraine, is Jewish and was elected with 73% of the vote. Those are the people that Putin's government calls Nazis, those voters. And here is that McDonald's in 1990, a couple days ago. It's gone. McDonald's has pulled out of Russia after 30 years, which is a sign of the times. So this is where McDonald's is, and this is where Stalin is in Russia today. So, I mean, get ready to get a lot of questions from your students about Russia in the coming years, because this is not a problem that's going to end anytime soon. And so, I see I've taken 50 minutes, so there's only 5 more minutes to 3:30. So I'm not sure how Stephen wants to play this, but I guess the last thing I'll just say is just to kind of revisit my thesis, right? I've showed you sort of the history in brief, and I've showed you that the government's position on the past, the definitive authoritative state position that can't be questioned, is constantly subject to fluctuation depending on the political needs of that particular state at any one time. The big joke in the Soviet Union was that the future is certain. It's going to be a Marxist paradise. It's the past that's unpredictable. That's the joke in the USSR. Because the Communist Party would occasionally, okay, circumstances have changed. It's now advantageous for this to be true about what happened. And so that is a massive, massive threat. And of course, in order to protect the phony history of pure national glory and greatness, the only way that the state can protect that history is to prevent educators and academics and civil society from being able to talk about it freely. So any narrative of national greatness almost axiomatically leads to the curtailment of freedoms. Because to protect the myth, we're going to need all of you to shut up. That's the danger. And Russia has totally succumbed to that danger now, which is why they're invading neighbors again. And Germany, after 3 months, Germany is so humane now that even in the face of the greatest threat to democracy and freedom in Europe in 2 generations, they only just now started sending serious armament, right? Because they know about war, because their society has taken on board the real lessons of World War II and the Holocaust. And Russian society has completely ignored those lessons. And it shouldn't have to be pointed out, but this is my last statement. History in the United States is contested too. Our history is contested. So that's what I wanted to say today. All right.
Questions while we're here? I know then I'm going to take full ownership for going over, but I did say in the beginning, I have a real hard time stopping a Holocaust survivor from talking. It's not going to happen very often. And tomorrow when we have Suzanne Schneider, I might just give up my 30 minutes and just post it somewhere online for later, because I'd much rather have her talk than me. So I apologize, because I want to honor everyone's time, Mitch's time, Richard's time, because they've taken the time to come here today to share and impart their knowledge to us. So I want to honor that, and also your time as well, because I promised you a 10 to 3, except tomorrow, which is 9 to 3, because we're doing an Auschwitz tour tomorrow morning, and it will not be recorded. So those of you who are online, it will not be recorded. So you have to be online. People have already hopped off. But if you got any questions, I know, Richard, did you download Hoopa?
Yeah, I have it.
And so if you want to post any questions, even after that, maybe you'll be on to be able just to check and respond to some of the questions that are in the Q&A for the session. It's under agenda, just Q&A, you're able to go in and type in responses to people if you posted any. I have had lots of requests for your images. We've had lots of requests for the picture stuff. There's a possibility of
I can just leave my USB with you.
That'd be great. And then what I'll do is we'll post everything we've gotten. We're going to do our best. We're going to post in a file in a Google Share Drive for you to have access to. So you have access to all this plus any lessons. I think this would be a really, we usually let everyone creates their own lesson plan, but it'd be real. Ruth and I were talking about. I don't know of any lesson plans that actually involve Soviet responses to the Holocaust. It'd be really interesting to see someone take these sources, these images, and what you've learned here from Dr. Plavneiks today to create a lesson out of that. Would be very interesting, because I could imagine many of you will get questions, especially with all that's going on. If you haven't had, especially with Putin making comments, just like he says, and that's what I hear most frequently is Ukraine is Nazi. That comes up a lot. A lot of students, they say it, and there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what does that mean, and it's very confusing. So I'd be curious to see what someone might put together as far as a lesson for that. But thank you so much for your time. I'll see everyone tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you've got any questions or problems, feel free to let us know, and we'll see you then. Thank you for your time today.